talks with our boss, I'd like to introduce Siim Land, on average health to top 1% health. Siim Land, anthropologist, best-selling author of 8 landmark books on longevity and health optimization, including the Longevity Leap and Metabolic Autophagy. Can I get a round of applause, please, and a warm welcome?
Hello, thank you. And I have some limited time, so I'll make it a bit quicker and we'll go through the slides. Who here wants to be in average health? Just, kind of mediocre health? No one? What about in top 1% health, like peak health? Yeah, most people here. So I guess that's what the goal of my speech is also going to be. I'm going to outline you some of the key characteristics of what top 1% of health would look like based on research. And health can have multiple definitions. It's the absence of disease, it's being in good fitness, good body composition, good mental health, physical health, all those things. And yes, they are all part of optimal health. But health is also something that you can quantify. You can measure it scientifically, and you can actually do a bunch of tests on yourself to see objectively how healthy you are. And more often than not, all these different biomarkers and health markers, they tend to follow what's called the Goldilocks zone. Too much of something is bad, not enough of something is also bad, and the optimal range is somewhere in the middle. Let's take blood sugar. If your blood sugar is too high, you have diabetes, and you can potentially die sooner. On the other hand, if you have 0 blood sugar in your bloodstream, you're also dead, because blood sugar is essential for survival. And that applies to virtually other biomarker as well that I will cover. So the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. A few examples of the Goldilocks zone, certain biomarkers that fit this model, things like your blood sugar, white blood cells, vitamin D, creatinine, hemoglobin, liver enzymes, IGF-1, muscle mass, body fat percentage. If your body fat is too high, you're obese, and that's associated with increased mortality. If you have very low body fat, that's also going to be counterproductive and harmful. HDL cholesterol, testosterone, red blood cells, electrolytes, sleep duration, as well as cortisol and stress. You need a small amount of stress and cortisol to be healthy, but if it's too high, then that leads to a lot of chronic diseases if you suffer from chronic stress. Now, there are a few exceptions to this. Not everything follows the Goldilocks zone. Based on research, is more that certain markers are better if they're lower as opposed to higher. A few examples of these markers include CRP, so this marker reflects inflammation. We know that inflammation is at the root of pretty much all chronic diseases, and it's one of the major hallmarks of the aging as well that drives the process of aging. If your inflammation is too high, the risk of a lot of chronic diseases is also higher. And the best inflammation for longevity is generally as close to 0 as possible. Triglycerides, which are these fatty acids in your bloodstream with the glycerol backbone, if they're too high, they're also associated with diabetes and metabolic syndrome because your body isn't able to utilize those fatty acids for energy. And if you have lower amounts of triglycerides in your blood, then that's generally associated with better metabolic health. Other examples like fasting insulin, Lp(a), homocysteine, ApoB, oxidized LDL, waist to hip ratio, waist circumference, visceral fat mass, and a few other markers as well that generally are better on the lower end. And what's on the lower end tends to be markers like inflammation, metabolic health, and certain amounts of visceral fat, which is a different type of fat compared to regular fat. Visceral fat is this fat around the organs. So where do you store the fat is also quite relevant to your optimal health. So if we look at statistics, then the general population would follow this standard distribution curve. It's not only in these epidemiological studies, but also in just other fields like economics, etc. So there is the bell curve. And most people, by definition, are in average health, so they fall into the middle of the bell curve. So they're either in the lower half of the bell curve or the upper half of the bell curve. So they make up something around like 68% of the entire population. On the other hand, the people who are healthier make up a smaller amount of the population because generally it's harder to find healthier people than people who are in average health. So the healthier the individuals are, the bigger minority they will make. So for example, 5% of people are the healthiest. They make up a very small amount of people compared to people in the middle of the bell curve. And vice versa, people on the bottom of the bell curve, these people are the unhealthier of the population. So these individuals have certain comorbidities and chronic diseases that can be prevalent in the society, but they still make up a smaller amount of the population. Obviously, this varies a lot between societies. Some societies are healthier than others, but the same rule still applies, that the standard distribution curve follows this same principle that most people are in the middle, and then you have a minority of people who are very healthy and a minority of people who are very sick. So our goal is to obviously get into the healthier side of the bell curve. And a good real-world example of this is inflammation status. So this particular study measured people's inflammation, and what they found was that a CRP level, which reflects inflammation, what was normal, was still associated with a significantly higher mortality risk compared to people with a lower CRP level, so below the normal reference range. So they saw that normal CRP of over 1 milligram per liter with a clear line, these individuals still had a pretty higher mortality risk compared to people with a lower CRP level, so less than 0.2, for example. These individuals with a extremely low CRP level, 0.2, which is much lower than what's normal, these individuals had a significantly lower mortality risk. So what it says is that normal necessarily isn't optimal. A lot of biomarkers follow the same principle that although it's in the normal reference range, it's not necessarily associated with a lower mortality risk. And normal can still put you at a higher mortality risk compared to someone who would be in a better health status. So whether that be top 10%, top 5%, or top 1%. So we want to shift ourselves more towards the upper end of the bell curve, more towards top 10, top 5, and top 1% of health based on the different biomarkers. So what does the average person's health look like? Based on statistics, the average male would be something like 89 kilograms. They're around 25% body fat, 102 centimeters waist circumference. Their VO2 max, which reflects their cardiorespiratory fitness, is something like 35 to 40 milliliters per kilogram per minute. They can do maybe 3 to 5 pull-ups. They can do maybe 25 to 30 push-ups. Their blood pressure is slightly elevated, so 125 over 80. Their CRP level, which reflects inflammation, is something like 1.5 to 2.5, so higher than normal. Their hemoglobin A1C, which reflects their average blood sugar, would be 5.5%, which is kind of average and normal. And their triglycerides and LDL cholesterol would also be slightly more elevated. Now, you don't need to remember these markers and their ranges. I'm going to be sharing with you the slides later as well, or you can send me an email, and I'll send you the slides with the specific numbers. What about the average female? The average female weighs around 77 kilograms. They might have 35 to 38% body fat, 94 centimeters waist circumference. Their VO2 max is 27 to 30. Because women have slightly lower VO2 max than men because they have lower muscle mass. They can do 0 to 1 pull-ups, 5 to 10 push-ups. Their blood pressure is also slightly elevated or closer to normal than males. Their inflammation is slightly elevated. Their hemoglobin A1C is kind of normal. And their triglycerides and LDL cholesterol would also be slightly elevated. So this would be representing the average person. So being able to do that for longer would also be reflective of doing lower body strength, which is very important as well. Body composition, so muscle mass and body fat percentage. So body composition is a big component to health and longevity. So excess body fat is associated with a lot of different comorbidities and chronic diseases. So for men, the top 10% body composition would be something like 15 to 20%. And for women, 25 to 30%. The best way to measure your body fat percentage would be to take a DEXA scan. There's also different types of devices that measure body fat percentage like the InBody, but the DEXA scan is a bit more accurate than other methods. Waist to hip ratio and waist circumference. So if you don't have access to a DEXA scan, you can still assess your body fat percentage by measuring your waist circumference, because as I mentioned earlier, visceral fat is this fat that accumulates around the organs, and if you have high amounts of visceral fat, then you have a bigger belly. Kind of this beer belly is a good sign of high visceral fat accumulation. And the top 10% of the waist circumference for males would be something like 90 to 95 centimeters, and 75 to 80 centimeters for women. The waist to hip ratio is the ratio between your waist circumference and your hip circumference. So you first measure your waist circumference, you get a particular number, and then you measure your hip circumference, you divide the waist circumference with the hip circumference, and you get a ratio. So it's healthier to have narrower waist than hips. So your waist should always be narrower than your hips, but it means that your body is storing fat more around the hips, which is a healthier phenotype, compared to storing a lot of fat around the waist, which is more associated with the visceral fat. Other biomarkers, so I'm going to list some of the major biomarkers that are most relevant to chronic diseases like heart disease, diabetes, and kidney disease, and there are particular reference ranges for top 10% of health. CRP, I mentioned that, inflammation, so something like 0.5 to 1 milligram per liter is a 10% marker for CRP. And there's also a lot of different other markers. I'm not going to go into all of them in detail because I would be just repeating numbers. But yeah, generally speaking, top 10% of health would involve having good metabolic health, which can be measured by things like hemoglobin A1C, your fasting insulin, your triglycerides, as well as good lipids like HDL, ApoB, LDL, good liver enzymes like ALT, AST, ALP, and GDT, good kidney markers like cystatin C and EGFR, and a good omega-3 index, which reflects the amount of omega-3 fatty acids in your red blood cells. So this omega-3 index, I think, is a very underappreciated but very relevant marker for overall health and future risk of chronic diseases. For example, Japan has an extraordinarily high omega-3 index on average. The average Japanese has an omega-3 index of something like 8 to 11%. So it means that they have quite a high amount of omega-3 fatty acids in the blood. Whereas the average Westerner in, let's say, America or Europe has it somewhere between 4 to 6%. So nearly half of what the Japanese people have. Top 5%, so moving closer to top 1%, the same markers, but generally speaking, top 5% would indicate a person is healthier than someone in top 10% of health. And they have a higher VO2max relative to their age, and they're able to do more push-ups and pull-ups. Body composition, so less body fat slightly for both males and women, but the difference between men and women in body fat percentage is that for women it appears to matter a lot less how much body fat they have when it comes to longevity. So anything between 20 to 35% for women doesn't really have an impact on how long they're going to live. Whereas for males, it appears to matter a lot. So as a man, for longevity, you want to keep your body fat relatively low. Whereas for women, they can get away with having a little bit of extra body fat for various reasons. Waist to hip ratio and waist circumference as well, so slightly narrower waist circumference, which would indicate lower visceral fat. Biomarkers, so the same markers, but even lower inflammation, even lower blood sugar, even lower triglycerides, even lower lipids, slightly higher omega-3 index, slightly lower liver enzymes, slightly better kidney function, and slightly better albumin as well, which is a marker of nutrition status. What about top 1% markers? So these are the markers that are associated with the lowest mortalities across large-scale population studies done over the course of many years, which I've researched. Fitness markers, so even higher VO2max, even higher push-up and pull-up ability.
VO2max is one of the best fitness markers for longevity. It's consistently and in many different studies associated with greater longevity and reduced risk of heart disease. And the reason for that is to have a high VO2max, you need to be doing exercise on a consistent basis. You can't cheat for a VO2max. Now there are maybe some easy ways you can cheat it a little bit, but you can't, cheat it a lot. If you have a high VO2max, then it means that you have good body composition, you exercise regularly, you have good nutrition as well. So it's a very umbrella marker for general health and general fitness that predicts longevity quite well. And the same way with these bodyweight exercises like push-ups and pull-ups. There's less studies on things like push-ups and pull-ups, but the ability to do bodyweight exercises is also something that involves, having a good body composition, having good nutrition, and having exercised for a consistent amount of time. Body composition. So the most optimal body composition for males would be something between 8 to 12% body fat, and for women maybe 18 to 22%. But as I said earlier, for women it doesn't really matter that much. The association between body fat percentage and longevity for women is much weaker than it is for males. As a man, you need to have good fitness, good muscle strength, and good body composition to give yourself the highest likelihood of living to 100, for example. And the waist circumference, now slightly, although obviously there's going to be a point of diminishing returns, but it's going to be very hard for someone to reach extremely low amounts of waist circumference. Biomarkers, so these are the biomarker ranges associated with the lowest mortality risk based on these dozens of studies. And very low inflammation, very low homocysteine, very good blood sugar regulation, very good lipids, very good kidney markers, very good liver markers, and a very good omega-3 index. So 9.5% and above would be a very good result for an omega-3 index. And the plateau for these benefits comes around 11%. So you don't need to necessarily have it like 12%, but 9.5% at least I think is a decent goal to have with the omega-3 index. And how do you achieve a good omega-3 index? Well, the Japanese eat a lot of seafood, they eat a lot of fish, they eat a lot of sea vegetables, sea moss, and those kind of other things. So that is the way they do it, but it's also possible to supplement omega-3s, for example, if you don't have a diet rich in seafood. And about 75% of the global population doesn't meet the daily requirement for omega-3 intake. So 75% of people are just chronically not eating enough omega-3s. In Japan, only 10% of people are under-eating omega-3s. Whereas in America, it's 90% of people aren't eating enough omega-3s. So it's literally like a tenfold difference between how much omega-3s they consume. I'll just give my own example as well. I've measured hundreds of biomarkers, and I have a lot of things are in pretty good shape. A lot of things are in top 1% of these markers. There's no one in the world who would have everything in like the top 1% of health. You have some markers that are going to be slightly worse, some markers that are going to be slightly better. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is to try to get as many of these different markers into the more optimal range. And the way you do that is obviously by testing, but also just having this scientific approach to it and knowing what needs to be improved. So if you don't even know what is the goal for these biomarkers, then you don't know where to go. So how do you improve these markers then? Let's talk about that as well. The biggest lever to all of this is exercise. So exercise is the most powerful intervention we know right now to extend health span and longevity. There's no supplement or pill that comes nearly as close to exercise, not even diet. And exercise improves all organ function. It will improve liver function, kidney function, heart function, brain function, blood vessel function, immune function. So it's literally kind of this one pill that you could do for your health. Exercise also targets all the hallmarks of aging. It improves all the various aspects of aging that go wrong during the aging process, such as chronic inflammation, mitochondrial function, cell senescence, telomere shortening, DNA repair, etc. So exercise is the magic pill. So a healthy exercise program should include both resistance training as well as some cardiovascular exercise. So you need to be doing some form of either weightlifting or calisthenics, as well as some form of cardio. Can be swimming, can be running, can be cycling, it doesn't matter. You need to be doing both aerobic as well as anaerobic exercise for optimal health benefits. The second big lever is body composition. So obesity is one of the major things that drives a lot of the chronic diseases like heart disease, kidney disease, liver disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and cancer. Obesity is a risk factor for all of these diseases. And by losing weight, you can expect to improve virtually all biomarkers. If you don't do anything else to your health, but you lose weight, it can be just even with fasting or, it doesn't matter how you lose the weight. If you lose the weight, you will see a reduction in blood pressure, blood sugar, lipids, visceral fat. Your VO2 max will actually improve even without exercise. Your heart function will get better, your liver function gets better, etc. So having good body composition and exercising, these are the two major keys to improving health. And you can get very far with just these two focuses. If you just focus on exercise and improving your body composition, you can get to virtually very close to top 1% of health, even without taking any supplements, without changing your diet, or without doing any other more advanced procedure. So here's a protocol that you can follow to reach top 10% of health. Once a week, cardiovascular exercise for 60 minutes, and the goal is to keep your heart rate at 60% of your maximum heart rate. Resistance training, so that can be calisthenics or lifting weights, 3 times a week for 30 minutes, that's enough. You don't need to do more than that. Sauna, so although that's not possible always, there is a lot of research about the health benefits of sauna, how saunas help to lower blood pressure, improve blood sugar, lower inflammation, etc. So the sauna is a very beneficial thing as well after exercise. Walking, a very underrated and easy thing for your health. If you walk around 9,000 steps a day, you have a 60% lower mortality risk compared to someone who walks 2,000 steps a day. And it's not that much. 9,000 steps is around 1.5 hours of walking. And that includes, going to the store, walking around the house, walking the dog, whatever the case is. You can easily accumulate 9,000 steps a day. You just need to include some physical movement into your day. Diet, so you don't need to have a perfect diet. It's more important to focus on things like exercise, in my opinion, than to have a perfect diet. If your diet is 80% perfect and 20% unoptimized, then you can get very good results with that. A few things you need to keep in mind is that protein, get at least 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. Alcohol, so closer to zero as much as possible. There was a recent study that found that being unfit is worse for you than drinking moderate amounts of alcohol. So it's more important to exercise than to be an abstainer from alcohol. But the best case scenario is you abstain from alcohol, or you have very small amounts of alcohol, but you also have good cardiovascular fitness. And socializing, an underappreciated component of longevity, can be about 1 to 3 hours a day. That's obviously very subjective of how much you want and need. But at 5% of health, the same program, you just add a little bit of more exercise, a bit of cardio, a bit of more resistance training. You walk a little bit more, so like 10,000 to 12,000 steps a day. You maybe do some more saunas, and you reduce your alcohol consumption a little bit more. And the 1% of health protocol, you do 3 times a week cardio, 3 times a week resistance training. You walk maybe 12 to 15,000 steps a day, and you try to sleep a little bit more as well. So on average, like 8 hours of sleep. The most important thing to any health protocol especially an exercise protocol, is progressive overload. You need to be getting over time. You need to be getting better over time for your body to keep getting results. If you don't get results, or you're overtraining, for example, you get injured, then you can experience a decline in health over time. So that's not what we want. Aging is characterized by this decline in health if you don't do anything. If you don't do anything to preserve your muscle mass and preserve your cardiorespiratory fitness, then things are just going to decline as you get older. Whereas if you keep exercising and you keep taking care of your health, then you can expect to even improve your health as you get older. So consistency is the ultimate thing that matters for health and longevity. A mediocre health plan executed for 5 decades is better than a perfect plan followed for a year or even 10 years. So having a perfect plan is not necessary. You just need to be consistent with some plan at least. Even if the plan is mediocre, if you follow a mediocre plan for the rest of your life, then that's better than just having a perfect plan that you follow for 1 year and then you quit because it's too much to bear. So I think that's a good message to also end on. If you want to get the slides, for example, then you can send me an email at info@siimland.com, and I'm Siim Land on all the social media platforms as well. Thank you.